Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 46 of the Team House. We are live here with our guest tonight, Sarah Carlson. Sarah Carlson served in the DIA and the CIA. She worked as a analyst, and she also worked as, excuse me, she also worked as a targeting officer. She is also the author of the new book, In the Dark of War, which I just finished reading 2 days ago. It is about her time spent in Libya in 2014, and it covers extensively the embassy evacuation of 2014 when they had to flee to Tunisia as the war heated up. So I think everyone knows who we are. I mean, I'm Jack Murphy. You can see co-hosts here, and one of these other, Brady Bunch squares, you can see Dave Park, and of course, Sarah. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're really happy to have you and hearing a little bit about your experiences in your book.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could start off telling us a little bit about your upbringing. You were brought up by your mother largely, big family, brought up with strong religious values, strong Christian values. And I was wondering if you could tell us the story about you and your brothers sitting around the table and your mother telling you the story about like your uncles and how like the whole family served in World War II. And then that pattern sort of repeated itself with you and your siblings after 9/11.
Yeah, growing up, this was a story I heard all the time that my mom used to tell us. She was really proud of her uncle, so my great uncle. My grandfather, her father, was in the Air Force and retired, and he did not get to go to World War II. He was just a little bit underage, but his brothers did. And so she told us the story about how, her grandmother would sit at the table and have them all there. So she had 4 boys and a daughter, which I thought was amazing because at the time, I had 3 brothers and, thought it was the most amazing thing ever. So I thought it was pretty cool that, my great aunt had 4 brothers. So the 3 of them served in World War II. And she told us about how her grandma would sit, like at the end of the war, she sat them down and was so thankful to have them all back that she didn't think they'd all make it back alive. And then shortly after that, one of my great uncles actually died in service. He was flying and they had to put it down. It was going down, and it could be, in the city, or he could stay on and redirect it. So
It was after the war, right? If I remember.
It was after, yeah. So it was something that she talked about quite frequently because, she was really proud of her uncle and his service, and then for all of them, but also knowing that we were all probably going to serve. We come from a really strong military background, so she knew at least a few of us would serve. I don't think she expected all 4 of us to go, but we did. So we all ended up going within like 6 months of each other, right? So I joined Defense Intelligence Agency because of 9/11. I was working in emergency management during college, so I was an intern, and that happened. And I was able to help that day with getting like the urban search and rescue team ready to go. And, it really left a big impact on me that I wanted to do something more, something bigger. And so my boss at the time recommended DIA. And around that same time, also right after 9/11, all 3 of my brothers signed up for the military. So I chose defense because they were going in defense. And so I wanted to, do something similar, something that would be able to help them. So I had my older brother joined the Army as an officer. And then the 2 younger ones, one went Army and one enlisted in the Air Force.
Did he get a lot of ribbing for that?
Yeah, you would think so, except most of my family has actually served in the Air Force. So my stepdad, who I'm quite close to as well, so he was former Air Force and he actually served in Vietnam. And then my grandpa was in the Air Force. And then I think of my own uncles, like two out of the 3 served in the Air Force as well. So it's pretty heavily, he was in good company.
But the irony, or I suppose, was you were the first to deploy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We were really competitive. So we were really close growing up. My older brother's only 13 months older than me. And then the two younger ones are like 2 and 3 years younger than me. So we're really quite close in age. So we grew up competing in a friendly way. We were really close. And so we left home, and we all left within, like I said, about 6 months of each other. And my mom was like devastated.
Yeah, having
right?
a heart attack.
Like, not only were we leaving the nest, but we were going, like, at that time we knew we were going to war in Iraq, right? It's like,
Yeah.
you're going from the nest to the war. So I left in early 2003 to join DIA, and I was a counterterrorism analyst with them. And I volunteered to go to Iraq. I knew my brothers were going to be going. Didn't know when, but it was inevitable, right? And so volunteered, and then 6 months later, so November 2003, I was on a plane on my way to Baghdad.
So, I mean, I know this isn't so much in your book, really, because the book focuses on Libya. But I mean, I think you mentioned in the book, like, your brothers are still in training.
Yeah.
And it sounded like, I mean, for you, it was like shake and bake right out the door, and like you were going right into it.
Right. I had a week of weapons training and then a week of like driving with DIA. So it was not extensive, but it was so early on then. I don't think that they had really planned ahead for what to do with civilians. But they were like, yeah, 6 months in, you're good. Let's do this. I went, and it was, like I said, it's so early on that we didn't quite know what we were getting into, right? It was when we were first starting to realize that terrorism was going to be a huge problem. And I was doing counterterrorism at the time. So they picked me. I was a counterterrorism analyst there, helping to start with that initial effort. I was at the ISG, so the Iraq Survey Group, and they were the entity charged with finding the WMD. So there were other groups that were doing counterterrorism with other elements of the military, but they wanted somebody there who could kind of help guide them through that. And so I was there with them, and then I was also there to support the DIA collection effort.
Could you tell us a little bit about what that entails, being an analyst, a defense analyst in this case? Because I think like John Q. Public kind of has this understanding, right, about like Navy SEALs. Like, they scuba dive, they come up on shore, they shoot some bad people, they blow something up and leave. Maybe they even have an understanding of like what a CIA case officer does, like a spy. Like, they have some general idea that, you go and you meet with sources in a cafe somewhere in Brussels or wherever it is. But I feel like that your job being an analyst, that's something that's like very much misunderstood in a lot of ways.
Right. And I feel like the only analyst in the movies is Jack Ryan, right? So
Yeah,
maybe
no, it is.
not
Yeah.
super reflective of reality. So, at headquarters, whether it was DIA or CIA, it's writing products, right? So it's not all that glamorous, but really important. So a big area of focus for me when I was at headquarters was threats against the United States. So of course that caught a lot of attention. So you just read through all the reporting that would be coming in. So I think people are generally aware that there are people out there collecting information all around the world. So reading the information that comes in from those officers, those reports, but then also anything in the news, talk in the book a lot. Later, not in 2003, but in 2013, social media was really important. So just looking at all the different sources of information and then putting it together, like figuring out what the key takeaway is, sort of the what and the so what. And in the military, it's the bluff, the bottom line up front, right? But it's the same kind of idea that you present the most important information first. So if you were in an elevator and you had to give your briefing, then that's when you gave it. So you would have to do it as quickly as possible. But then, there were other briefings I was in where like one time I briefed a combatant commander, and I want to say I was in there for like 2 hours, just had a lot of questions about what was going on. And so it varied sort of in style and in tone depending on who you were briefing or who you were writing for. So the primary product for DIA that we would write for would be for the J2, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He got a daily briefing, probably still does, I don't know. And then also the Secretary of Defense. So actually a really cool story, it's not in the book. The first paper I wrote at DIA, it was Secretary Rumsfeld at the time. And like his office actually called me and said that they really liked it. And then he signed it and sent it back to me, which was pretty cool.
That's pretty cool.
That is cool.
I was like, I think I've chosen my profession well. Like, this is
Are you allowed to say what that paper was on?
No.
As an analyst, where were you getting your information? I know you said like open source and things like that. So not the information, but where were you getting your directives from? Like, what specifically were people tasking you? Hey, we want to know about this. Were you just kind of deciding what needed to be followed? How did that process happen?
It was actually both. So we did get a lot of taskings where, a policymaker might see a bit of information, read a bit of news, and want to know more about it. And so then we would prepare an assessment based on that question. So there was definitely a direct response to tasking. And then there was also, like I said, for me, it was, threats. So there wasn't really ever a time when that wasn't going to be important. But then, I think for general awareness, there's also the National Priority Intelligence Framework. So there's like a set process where we identify, strategically where we want to go as a country, the information that we need to get there, and then what the gaps are to attain that information. So it's the gaps that we're trying to fill, and it's the analysts that write about that information in those gaps.
So I'm almost like, I feel like a little bad, like bringing this up right off the bat, but before moving on from DIA, because there's just something in your book that I was like kind of like shocked by. It was like something you hear rumors about, but you said the National Guardsman or woman next to you in the next room over was literally a lady of the night having gentlemen callers over at all hours.
Yes. Yeah, no, this is like, I've heard other people say like, oh, I heard about stuff like that, or I knew a guy who said that.
Yeah.
No, she was my roommate. So I know. So in Baghdad, again, very early on, I was at Camp Slayer, and there were these like the pods, the Connex boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, there were some designated for sleeping quarters and some for bathrooms. And then the ones for sleeping quarters, there were so many people that we were double or triple or quadruple. There were not a lot of women there at the time. So there were only a few of these pods designated for women. And so it was literally, I don't know, everybody knows what the Connex is, but like a trailer thing, like on a train, right? Like converted shipping container, essentially. And then it had, we just had curtains that were sheets that were between our bunk beds. So there was like a foot locker, and then like the bunk bed, and then the sheets.
This is before they had the CHUs, the compartmentalized housing units, like all that fancy stuff before that.
Oh yeah, this is like really early on. So there were two other women in there, and they were both with the National Guard, and then me. And I was a civilian. I was 24 at the time when I deployed there. I actually deployed on my birthday, weirdly. So I got there, and at first, I thought she was just like having a really good time. I didn't really know that it was a business on the side. So there were a couple of moments where, got a little sketchy, right? Like guys angry, trying to pound on the door, trying to get in. So that was not okay. And then I was really worried that like once it became clear that this was not like a once in a while fun time thing, this was something else, it scared me. So I was like sleeping with my, then I had like a SIG Sauer. So I was literally sleeping with me next to me, because I was really worried like somebody was going to come to the wrong curtain. Right.
Yeah.
So I reported it. I was going to have to testify. They did end up, I heard, so the AD, so they ended up telling me that they did court-martial her, but on the way out when they redeployed, they did a spot check and they found the cash, which was like 2 entire Foot Lockers full of cash, and video evidence. So with the video evidence, I didn't need to. But the reason I guess it had been so complicated is that the chain of command was involved.
Really?
Well, who am I to judge an entrepreneurial young woman? But that was that's one of those stories I probably would not have believed if I had not heard it from the person themselves. If I had not heard it from somebody who is
Right.
an unfortunate witness.
It's like I knew
Oh
a
my
guy,
gosh.
and then nope, that was my roommate.
Yeah. Yeah. Those were always the kind of stories I heard, like third-hand hearsay, like, come on. That's not real.
Nope, it was a thing.
All right. Moving on from that insane story. How did you make the jump from the DIA to the CIA?
So I did a lot of different things when I was with DIA, right? So I was in Baghdad for a while, and then when I got back, they were looking for people to go to, then it was TTIC, the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, which became the National Counter-terrorism Center. So I volunteered, it's a common theme, volunteer, to go. And ironically, the reason I didn't join the military is because I wanted to reserve my right to say no. And then I volunteered for everything anyway. I know, I should have. But yeah, I went there and I was there for a couple of years, and then I ended up going to Northcom. And so I think it was that collective experience of having done all these joint assignments where I really got a lot of exposure to, you know, working with the different agencies, especially at NCTC. You got to work with a whole wide range. And then also, you know, at Northcom, it's a little different than working with the military deployed, because it was a joint command. So it was US and Canadian there, and, you know, just really different sort of interesting mission. So I think that helped with getting the job at CIA, that I had already had these connections and the variety of experience and deployment. Because again, it was not that common at the time to have deployed to a war zone even then. So applied to CIA, got that job, and there I continued to serve as an analyst in the Counterterrorism Center. So I was still CT analyst. I was called a targeting analyst. So even though I say counterterrorism analyst, or you hear targeting officer, the official designation was targeting analyst. So it was kind of a hybrid of those things. And then I continued to look at, again, like threat information against the US and the West specifically. So it was mostly coming from the groups that were it was entirely coming from the groups operating overseas, but the main focus was Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda central leadership. And then we were just starting at that time to see them getting more active with external plotting from like Yemen and North Africa.
Was it much of a culture change for you? Did they do things the same? Did it require any more schooling or anything like that? Like, what was that process like?
Yeah, that was probably the interesting part, is going back to analyst training after having already been doing it for a while. But you know, CIA has a very specific style of writing and briefing that they want everybody to do. Actually, one of the coolest parts I thought about working at CIA is there was a heavy emphasis on like, you're not briefing or representing yourself, right? You're representing the CIA. So it was a really different sort of optic from DIA, where you would be put in front of like a general and expected to have, you know, the credibility. Whereas if you're in front of like a general as you know, the CIA person, it just has a different kind of weight behind it. And so that was one of the cool parts about going through that training is, you know, you kind of learn sounds bad, but you learn the analytic line. So this is what we're assessing at the moment. And then that helps you look for like deviations from that, or, you know, information that could change that. So it was really interesting to come at it from that perspective, where like I still use the royal we a lot, even in my current job. We're like, well, we believe. I'm like, no, I believe now. But at the time, that it actually was really good for briefing, and it was intentional. So a lot of times, like if you were briefing like a member of Congress or something like that, they might so like, how long have you been doing this, or something like that. And so especially for the newer analysts that were just coming on, that I think really helped them feel like more confident in what they were doing and what they were saying.
And did you also, because You did learn Arabic. Did you go to? How did that process take place as a language training?
So I learned Arabic to go to Libya specifically.
Oh,
so
okay.
I did spend most of my career looking at terrorist groups operating in South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. So throughout that region, just at different times. But I didn't actually learn Arabic until the year before I went to Libya. So once I knew I got that assignment, that was in 2012. So I actually applied again, volunteered before the Benghazi attacks of 2012. And so I was in language training when they happened.
So before moving on to Libya, is there anything you can tell us about, when you were working external ops beforehand? Or is there any, as far as, is there anything that's made like public domain that you're allowed to talk about as far as like plots that were interrupted or thwarted or anything like that?
I think, sort of every plot that you can think of that was directed against the homeland from Al-Qaeda, I was probably involved in some way, shape, or form with the assessment side. So anything that, again, so like the main product for CIA analysts is the PDB, or the Presidential Daily Briefings. There's, I think, a lot that's been written and talked about that. So that's sort of the pinnacle of what CIA analysts write for. And I can tell you, basically any threat against the homeland was PDB level. So there's a lot of long hours that would go into writing that. So, I'd start, like, if I got into work at like 7 a.m. and I read a new report that just came in about a threat to the homeland, then I would brief that sort of at the morning meeting and say, like, I think we need to write about this. And then it would be decided throughout the day if it was going to go in the PDB or not. And at that point, like by then I knew what was going to go in, right? So just be writing it and be ready to put that information into context. A lot of it too is, providing the context for if it seems bogus, right? Like there are a lot of people like walk-ins and write-ins and that kind of thing saying, this is like random, like I'm going to attack the United States. So you just have to put that kind of thing into context about like if we think it's true or not. And, a lot more nuance than that, but it would take all day, and then you would have to submit it to like multiple rounds of coordination. So go through many layers of review, and then it would go to like later it became the DNI, right? So he would have to sign off on anything that went into the PDB. So usually that sign off didn't happen until like midnight or 1 a.m, right? It would take a really long time to do that. And then we'd have to be in the next morning to brief it to the PDB briefers very early in the morning, like around 5 a.m. So, it's not a lot of hours between 1 and 5. So
Sure.
drive home, get a couple hours sleep, and then drive back in. And then you brief it, and then, people go out and they brief their policymaker. And then once that's done, then the questions start coming in, right? So if anybody didn't really understand or need a clarification, and then like sometimes those would take all day again. And then sometimes like the answer would be so interesting that they would want to pull it again into the PDB. And there's really, really long hours. And then there were other times where there was like a threat stream. So like things just kept coming in, things we were really worried about. And so then it would kind of turn into like a string of daily updates.
Was that like pretty cool though? I mean, on a personal level, like as someone, you're in your 20s and you're writing reports that are being read and briefed to the president.
Yeah, it's awesome. Right? It's super cool. Yeah.
During
it was exhausting, but yeah, at that time in my life, that was like the coolest thing I could be doing.
During that time, were there a lot of threats? Were there a lot of credible threats? Were there all the close calls? I think that, here when we're living in America, like we don't maybe understand or get a sense of what we're facing. Are we facing anything? What's out there for us?
Yeah, I think, it was quite busy. I was pretty busy the whole time I was doing that, without going into a lot of detail. But yeah, I think like you'd hear things in the news, and if an attack didn't happen, then people start to discount it a little bit more. But, there were also a lot of efforts going into making sure that the attack did not happen. So even though we get this reporting about a threat, and then, like maybe like DHS would put out a notice to like the local level, and if it never came to fruition, then I think there's a tendency to start discounting that more and more. So there was always a balance between like how much do you say, like how specific and credible is it? Because if you keep warning, then it's the chicken little thing, right? Like
Right.
people stop believing. But yeah,
So
it was busy.
let's start talking about Libya. Like, when did Libya first pop up on your radar? When was that a potential deployment for you, where they were talking about shooting you over there? And how did that all come about?
So they found documents in the Osama bin Laden raid, right? I think people know there was a lot of document exploitation. So some of that we found they talked about Al-Qaeda talked about using Libya as a base to launch attacks against Europe. And that's all come out. Like you can look that up online. I think I have it as a footnote in the book, right? So you can actually read the letters exchanged on it. So when I read that, when I heard about that, like I'd always very much focused my attention on threat reporting. So even within counterterrorism, there's a lot of different things you can do, right? You can track individual people, so be like the HVT team. For me, it was always like that protection side of things. Like I wanted to analyze and assess threats against people I care about, right? So when I read that, I knew I wanted to take on that assignment when it came up. That was something I felt pretty passionately about. I was super dedicated. It was like long hours, like I said, and even getting into Libya, it was like the time I woke up in the morning until I went to bed. I was thinking about Libya. I was reading about Libya. I was writing about it. So it's sort of like all consuming.
But first you had to go and learn Arabic for that deployment.
Which again, like me being like obsessively dedicated, right? So I would literally be studying Arabic like at the bar. I had flashcards, so there'd be like the Arabic on one side and the English on the other, and I'd be like sitting there, trying to memorize it if I was in line, like anytime there was a free moment. And then I went through the class. So the class for Arabic, it's a difficult language to learn, and I feel like people are generally aware of that. So just to put it like in a framework around it, the Arabic, to do one full year, the goal is to get to level 2. So there's 5 levels in the language. So 0 is like you maybe can say hello, and 5 is native.
This guy right here, 0, 0.
Oh yeah. I feel like I'm slowly working my way back towards that. Like, use it or lose it. So one full year got you to a 2. So like in the Romance languages, like Spanish or Italian or whatnot, it's like 3 months will get you to a level 3. To get to a level 3 in Arabic, you had to do the full 2nd year, and that would get you to the level 3. So I did the 2 years, and I put a lot of my intention on reading, because I figured as an analyst, it'd be more important for me to know how to read than actually talk. So even now, like my speaking was never as good. And part of that is like I traveled enough through the Middle East to know that as soon as people see me, they want to talk to me. They want to practice their English. So, I could say hi to them in Arabic, but then they want to be practicing. And so I always emphasize the reading a little bit more.
And so while you were in language training, the Benghazi attacks happened. And I mean, I think everyone who watches this podcast or checks it out is familiar with that. They've seen the movie 13 Hours. They've heard from Chris Peranto, who is there, probably pretty aware of those attacks. But I feel like your story in the dark of war is kind of like the next chapter of what happened after all of that. And so what were you thinking when those attacks popped off in 2012 while you were in the language course?
I was worried, right? Like I knew people who were there, and it was really quite sad. It was a major attack against us, and um, I'd had other colleagues that have been lost, and it's tragic. It's really hard to go through that, and then to know that I was going there. I think it just really made me even more dedicated and determined that I was gonna do everything in my power to keep that from happening again, to the people that I was there with. So I think if anything, it just really amped up my determination. Um, and so I think too, a lot of people don't realize the role of an analyst in a war zone. Like how could I prevent something like that from happening? So the way that works is like we had security officers and the Marines, and then sort of like all the embassy US mission personnel. So I would be there and I'd be reading everything that came in and doing the analyst thing. So I'd brief up at the country level to the ambassador, like more strategically, right? It was sort of big picture, what's going on, what's the stability of the country like, what are things on the horizon that we need to be worried about. But I also briefed the Marines and the security officers on a regular basis. So I was like constantly in the team room, letting them know like, hey, I just read about, like there was a shooting on this corner over here. Here's what I think's going on. You might want to be aware of it. Either go check it out or just avoid the area, depending on what the information was. So I was doing that, in the beginning, probably on a weekly basis. And then at the end, it was daily. And it was also, we're looking at like status of forces. So we were, I know I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but we were kind of being surrounded, which I'll explain later. And so it was being able to talk to all the security officers about what was going on there. And then, of course, I was also relaying everything back to CIA headquarters. So everything that I was doing in briefing, I was also documenting to go back to headquarters.
So you arrived when you arrived in Libya. I mean, what can you tell us about the status of the country at that time? Obviously the Libyan civil war had happened, Benghazi had happened from the American perspective. You have militias running wild. I mean, I've had Libya described to me as being like an open city, like it's a place where any mafia can go and operate. And I don't know how you feel about it. I'm interested in what your thoughts are about Libya when you arrived, when you hit the ground there.
So there was definitely a shift from the beginning. So I got there in July 2013. So it was a few months after the Benghazi attacks. And I think people are a little more sort of sympathetic to our presence. They weren't angry at us. There was understanding about, like why we were there and what we were doing. But it was the book and my experience is everything that happened after it, and it was always on our minds. Always, it was my main focus was to prevent something like that happening again. So in the beginning, the sort of the local atmosphere was like completely lawless, like completely. So there was no security force, there was no military. That was under the control of the Libyan government. So after the revolution, after the Arab Spring, there were all these militias that fought, right? And so it's a bit similar to like what happened in Iraq, but this was definitely more tribal, and a lot of it was affiliated with the tribes and then the different neighborhoods. So even the ones that were brought into like the security forces were brought in wholesale, so they remained loyal to their militia or their tribe and not the central government. So one of the things that I was particularly concerned with was similarities between what happened in Benghazi and then what happened in Tripoli, right? So I write about this in the book too. I wanted to know like what they did there and what happened there, and how that if something similar happened in Tripoli, did that mean, there was going to be another attack like that? So like looking for signposts or tripwires, like that kind of thing. one of them was that in Benghazi, they used a militia for outer security, right? That's, I think, pretty well known, and the problems that came from that, which were detailed in 13 Hours, that they didn't know, like, if that militia ended up being involved in the attack or not, and if they were helping them, or it just became quite complicated because they didn't know where the loyalty of that militia was. So in Tripoli, so I was assigned to the residence compound, and then there was the embassy facility. So it was, again, two compounds. And we were on the Zintan land. So that was a tribe and also a militia. They had multiple militias, but we also contracted with them to provide our outer security. So they did the outer perimeter security. So again, we had to rely on the militia to do that. So one of the efforts while we were there was sort of creating a military, or the GPS or GPF, which was like a colossal failure.
And that whole debacle you relate with the Libyan Special Forces unit that are the military guys, U.S. military, were trying to train. It was pretty like, wow, really?
Yeah, and that happened really early on. So that was August. So North AFRICOM had this 1208 training program, and it was at Camp 27. For those who are familiar with Libya or the bases there. So they were doing that training there, and they had, we had provided like weapons and equipment and that kind of thing. And then militia came in, and it was just like militia fighting with each other. And one militia attacked the other militia who had the base, and then they took all the weapons and all the equipment. All this like really advanced, the things you don't want in the hands of a militia, right? So yeah, they took it all, and they never really figured out or really even looked into who did it, where they went. I remember one day we went out, we were looking for like one of the tanks, and we found it, and so we're just kind of like driving around trying to see if we could see it or like talk to them. And there are all these militia compounds, and yeah, it was just pretty wild. So like there was no even like law enforcement, right? So driving was absolutely insane. People are just like pedal all the way down as fast as they could go, like on the wrong side of the road. It was just completely lawless. There weren't any kind of enforcement of anything. There was government entities. So you can kind of break it down if you're interested in the
Yeah, and how the country is divided east, west, and south. Oh, like I'm really interested in like the geopolitical situation and the tribal militia situation that shook out while you were there.
So the government had a prime minister. So at the time it was Ali Zaidan, and then there was also a president. I just got this thing. I'm really sorry.
No, it's okay.
I was going to restart my computer. No.
There's also been a few turnovers in country leadership as the years went on.
Yeah, well, after Gaddafi was killed, there was definitely this greater split into the East, the West, and then the South. So that set up an interesting dynamic too. And then so there was the prime minister, and then the president, and then there was the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense. And then certain militias reported to the Ministry of the Interior, including the Zintan, and then certain militias reported to the Ministry of Defense, which included the Misratans, which I haven't mentioned yet, but they were one of the other key groups that ended up actually starting the like Operation Dawn in the Civil War. So those two were often at odds together or against each other, and that really created a lot of the instability in Tripoli proper. So the Misratan militia would come over and help with security whenever like the president or the MOD needed them, and then whenever the prime minister or the MOI wanted assistance with security, then they would call the other militias. So there was a lot of tension between them. And then the airport was very much like a center of gravity, like a control point. And the Zintan provided the security for that. So they were like Customs and Border Patrol, basically. They just decided they were going to do that, and then they did. So it was, weird that a militia would be like running an airport. There was just a lot of really weird stuff that was going on.
Speaking of which, who were the other external actors who were mucking around in Libya? I mean, obviously, I think we know America was there. We had our hands in it. Were there any European or Middle Eastern powers that were also trying to play some games in there?
Yeah. Yes, all of them. So, I don't know that there wasn't anybody not interested. I think still there's a lot of reporting coming in about like Russian involvement in Turkey and Egypt and the UAE, and it was a former Italian colony. So like the relationship with Italy has always been sort of unique and special, even when it was Gaddafi. So yeah, there was a lot of involvement from other governments, and that certainly it changed the dynamics as well. So throughout the year, the divide kept deepening, right? And so then once these other countries started getting involved, then you also had people supporting like one side or the other, which then exacerbated that divide and made it worse.
They would align with the different tribes and kind of not necessarily pit them against each other, but place their interest in a particular tribe.
Yeah, or a particular movement. So I think the Operation Dignity with Khalifa Haftar. So when that started, and that didn't start till 2014, like May 2014. Once that started, that really brought in a lot of the outside involvement. That was really one of the factors that affected that. So Egypt, I think, is probably the most notable that people are aware of, that they really kind of threw their weight behind Haftar and his operation there. So the US, our policy was kind of wait and see. Didn't want to get involved, didn't want to support one side or the other, didn't want to pick a side. So we were very much like hands off. And then the ambassador ended up meeting with a lot of these different groups, which kind of then just like pissed off everyone, right? And she was just meeting with them all and, posting pictures and that kind of thing. So that ended up making people, I think, equally angry.
So we were just kind of like kicked back, hedging our bets and say, hey, we'll put our money behind whoever the victor ends up being.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the elected government of Libya, but then that was also really complicated, right? And so
right.
At first it was appointed, and then like a lot of what deepened that divide too was that some people thought that they needed elections sooner than later, and the government that was in place when I first got there wanted to extend their mandate to remain in authority, and so that would extend the mandate of like the president and the Congress and all that, and people were very angry about that. The Libyans really wanted to have their own democratically elected government. So there were like massive protests, the largest that we had seen since like the revolution, that they didn't want to do that. And the militias started getting involved, and there were sort of like armed takeovers of Congress for, a couple days at a time, and then they would leave. So between July 2013 and then when we evacuated, you just saw all this like tension, and there were multiple different groups operating, and it was always trying to figure out like who was operating with who was on whose side, because in the beginning there was a balance in that there were so many groups, right? So one group could take power, and that would last like a hot second before somebody else came in and took it from them, right? But then once the groups started joining together, then they became more powerful. And so if there was a like a block of these different groups that came in and tried to take power, then that was a lot more significant than just like one tribe or one militia. And so I was looking at how those alliances were forming and how strong they were getting.
In regards to Haftar specifically, he's an interesting character in that he was captured during the 1988 Toyota War in Chad. And then he pops up and he's living in Virginia for a couple decades. And then after Gaddafi goes down, he's suddenly back in Libya, ostensibly running things. One could speculate how all of that happened. But from what you're telling me, it sounds like we didn't quite have this guy under our thumb, maybe the way we would have liked to have had him.
I think he's certainly gone rogue if we ever thought that we did, right? No, I would guess that's part of the reason they didn't, like, the US government and the strategy at the time, like, we don't want to pick a side because that would look really bad, right? If we picked Haftar, like that would not end well. So once he got involved, I think that was actually part of the reason why we were like, whoa, we're just gonna kind of wait and see.
In all these tribal battles for supremacy, did anybody ever use the tank?
They did, yeah.
Did it ever show up?
In fact, they did at the end.
USA.
Who knows too if it was like our tank or somebody else's tank, but yeah, there were a lot of tanks. So I know, right? In the interview that you sent me, that I watched a little clip of, he talks
with Andrew.
Yeah, with the technicals and how they rolled around as like very Mad Max. Like, yes, Libya was a very Mad Max. There were like all these improvised vehicles with like these huge rocket barrages just like welded onto the frame and really like rolling around with like 10 guys hanging off in like military uniforms, but they were all like mismatched. So like shirt from one, pants from another, and flip-flops, of course. So it was really Mad Max.
Now, you are, the analyst, you have to brief policymakers, but, and interestingly, we'll get into this also, you sound like you got along pretty well with all these, sweaty ex-special operations bros who were doing security, but you didn't have such a great relationship with the ambassador at the time.
So, yeah, it was a little contentious. I tried really hard. So I joked really early on, right? Like when I was talking about like the 1208 Camp 27 takeover thing, like right around the same time, there was this incident where the Misratan militia came to Tripoli to help provide security. And it was around that same time at the end of Ramadan. So it was like August. And there were reports that it was a coup attempt. And so in the weekly intelligence briefing with the ambassador, I think I'm really funny. No, she didn't. But I joked that it was a faux coup because, there was like a mixed reporting about what was happening. She did not find that funny. And it was like the first time I was like, all right, this is going to be interesting. So I brief her, and like from then on, it was like, very professional, like no joking, just this is what's going on. These are the assessments. This is some of the interesting reporting. And it became a problem when like she would hear something from like a political peer, right? So maybe somebody in Congress or the president or something like that. And Libyan, not US. So from her Libyan colleagues, and if what she heard from them didn't match up with sort of what I was briefing her, then that's when it kind of became contentious and, trying to explain like, well, this might be what they're telling you, but this is what other people are saying that they're doing, or, that kind of thing. So that's when it became problematic, but I took my responsibility very seriously. Like I needed to make sure that she heard me, that it was important that I didn't just piss her off or like continue to make jokes, right? Like if she clearly didn't like that style, then it was really important that I find a way to get her to hear the intelligence. She didn't need to hear me. She needed to hear the intelligence. And so I had to find a way to do that.
Did she get the country? Did she understand how the tribal politics worked and things like that?
Yeah, I think she was pretty familiar with it. And she had come, I think before that, she was in Kuwait. So she had a lot of experience in the Middle East. And she's also spoke Arabic. So I do think she understood what was going on. But as it continued to get worse, and more dangerous, I think that, people react to danger very differently. And I think it started to affect us all in different ways.
And isn't it, it seems that for CIA analysts, it's like a point of personal pride that your analysis is detached from emotion, that it's just sort of the ground truth. There's no politics. You don't insert your opinions into it. It just is what it is. But it sounds like it might have been difficult in this situation as Libya slid into decline, that you're having to tell the ambassador, ostensibly your boss and country, things that maybe she just doesn't want to hear.
She definitely didn't. And a lot of them were threats against her, right? So that's also,
like her against her physical self.
Yeah. To be fair to her, like a lot of what I was briefing her on every week was like, okay, so, we got another report that they want to, and I couldn't brief her like this group is intent on killing the ambassador. I'm like, no, they want to kill you, which is, that's a hard thing to brief and to talk about. And I think hard to hear too, right? So there was a lot of threats against her specifically, and then against diplomats, and then against any American in the country. And in fact, we had like several incidents throughout the year. So it wasn't like they weren't happening either, that people were being targeted, and we knew they were coming. And so I think that certainly affected like the dynamic with her and like what she wanted to hear or not. Like after a while, you don't want to hear that they want to kill you, right? Like that okay, I got it. They don't like me, they want me dead. And then try to work around that.
And of course we have to mention, it would have been 2 ambassadors previous. Chris Stevens made the ultimate sacrifice in Benghazi, our ambassador to Libya. So, this is not like hypothetical. This is like something that's very real.
Yeah. And I will say that I know that I write about it, and there was like tension between us, and it was a bit contentious at times, but she did listen to me. And at the end, when the fighting was so bad, I was going over to brief her every day, and she wanted me to be going over there and briefing her every day. So even if she didn't like what I was saying, and that that affected me too, right? Like I'm not going to write as objectively about like, and then she got really mad at me. So I know that that affected me too, when she was bringing me over there every day, and like I was risking, like literally to go anywhere, it was risking my life. There were bombs going off all around me, and it wasn't like I was just going on my own. Like 2 security officers had to go with me, and then usually also the either my boss or the special operations forces representative, he would go with me. So there was a small group of us, but you can look at it a couple different ways, right? That, I was mad that she was making me go over there. That was also like a great honor that she trusted me that much and relied on my information so much that she wanted me to come over and brief her every day. So, I did it, and I know she listened. There were some times where she didn't. So there's, I think, one example in the book that I use is she wanted to send some people out who were panicking, right? So this was during the heavy fighting. I realize I'm not quite in chronological order.
And there were some State Department employees who were like, "I'm out, bro. I'm out. I can't do this anymore."
Yeah, and this is already after we had like multiple drawdowns, right? So this is like at the end, the fighting was going on. There was no way to get out. We were like scrambling to try to think of what we could do, and she decided that she didn't care what it took or what the risk was. She was getting these people out, and that was really hard for me. And one of the first times I really questioned, like, well, then what am I doing here if I'm literally risking my life to go over there to tell her this is a terrible idea? in, you know, like
Right.
a lot of good words, not those words.
Duly noted and disregarded. Thank you.
Right. So I'm like, well, what's the point? So she decided to do it, that she trusted this person who was a former Libyan Islamic fighting group member.
Sounds legit.
Right. Because he was handsome, so it's cool. Yeah, no, I mean, that was literally one of the hardest moments, is to hear her say, well, you know, I hear you, I know the threats, but I'm doing, or the risk, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Wow.
And that's a tough call, I think, for her to make too. I mean,
it
worked.
The threats that were coming in, were they consistently from the same tribe, same group? I mean, were there any groups or tribes that you guys could trust at any given time, or was it just random?
We chose to rely on Zintan because we lived on their land. So we tried really hard to maintain that relationship. The one we were most worried about was Ansar al-Sharia. So that was the group that conducted the Benghazi attacks. So it was the same group. They were still operating there throughout the year. That was something that I was really focused on. I needed to pay attention to where they were operating, who they were cooperating with, and if they were coming to Tripoli. So those were kind of the three main things I always had at the center of my attention, because of all the groups that could attack us, it was most likely going to be them again. And then there were two incidents, right? There were two major capture operations that happened in Libya while I was there. And those both generated a lot of threats against us. And we kind of anticipated that, but it's still destabilizing and, you know, incredibly heightened the risk against us.
Ken, before we get into the actual evacuation of the embassy and how that kind of played out, could you talk to us a little bit about these, you know, former special ops guys that you worked with? Like, they all have very colorful names in the book. You had to give them pseudonyms, of course. You know, like, who were these guys? What were they doing? Like, what was the deal?
Yeah, I changed all the names and combined some people. So I put that right at the beginning of the book. Part of that was to protect their identities. And then also I had to, like, numbers are a really sensitive issue. So it was twofold.
Right. You don't want somebody to be able to count the number of names and figure out, well, compound has this many people there.
Right. So yeah, so they were our security officers, and they provided the physical security for us. So I think people are aware, like the Marines, they protect like the building or the information, but our security officers were very specifically there to protect us. So they would go on all the moves with us, which was any sort of high risk operation and travel around town, and everything in Libya was considered high risk. So they went with us on all of it. So they were all, almost all had some kind of special operations background. So, you know, the Ranger or SEAL or please don't judge me, everybody, for forgetting others. So they all had extensive backgrounds in special operations of some kind. So I think it was like 7 years was the minimum to even apply. And then the ones who didn't have special operations had some kind of other sort of elite security type background. So there were a number of them on the compound, and sort of rotated in and out throughout the year. And I tried really hard to sort of establish a good relationship from the beginning, because I knew they were going to be keeping me safe. So I wanted them to have the best information possible to save me. But then also, like, I became friends with a lot of them, and I'm still in touch with a lot of them to this day. Several have reached out, you know, like excited about the book and stuff. So been pretty supportive. Yeah, they went with us anytime we had to leave the compound. So like even to the airport. So like I was picked up at the airport the day I arrived by 2 security officers. So they're, like totally kitted out, but then have like a flowing shirt on over the top. So it's obvious to me that they, had like body armor and stuff on. And then we drove an armored vehicle. So there were like Toyota SUVs that we would drive around, the Land Cruiser, but they were high level armor. And they, at the beginning, it was sort of one security officer would drive, and then sort of around spring 2014, so like April, May, we had a couple of incidents where rockets were launched at compounds very, very close to us. And so we were trying to figure out like if we were actually being targeted or not. But after those 2 incidents is when we did the drawdowns, and then we also increased the security posture. So from then on, it was like 2 security officers. And then once it got even worse, then it was like, okay, a couple of vehicles with a couple of security officers. So as it continued to devolve and become more dangerous, then that security posture increased to match it.
There's a moment in the book, and I don't think you meant it this way, but when I read it, I was laughing because you said something like, yeah, when I worked at CIA headquarters, I was always surrounded by smart people, and now this is so different.
Oh no. No. Oh God.
I know you didn't mean it like that, but I was laughing so hard when I read that. I was like, oh, she knows us too well.
Oh no. I had a lot of respect for the guys who were there. Like they were all well educated. I was actually one of the sort of not normal CIA officers. I don't have my master's degree, which is pretty unusual for a CIA analyst. So yeah, I don't think I have that pretension, but no, I feel really bad now. It's taken that way.
No. I understood. And one of the, I mean, it bears mentioning, since it's such it's prominent in your book, that there one of these guys, ended up, your boyfriend and girlfriend, for a while.
Yeah, we met there. So in the book, I call him Nomad. Mm-hmm. He's a former Navy SEAL, and we ended up dating for several years even after we left. So he played a pretty significant role in the team when he was there, and then also, really helped me once we left, and I was sort of going through all the aftermath of what happened.
Right. And I mean, as this, I'd like to hear you describe, the situation as like the walls figuratively came closing in around you guys, and you had to make this kind of dramatic exit from the country. But it really was, I mean, I guess you could, it's a cliche, but it was sort of like, your Jack Ryan moment, like here is Sarah Carlson, CIA analyst, but now she's got an M4 rifle in her hands, and like you're the TC in the vehicle, and it's like, now you're like ride or die, like this is for real, and you went through all of it, and you did it with these guys.
Yeah, it was again one of those situations where it was very intimidating and scary, but also really complimentary that they wanted me to serve in that position with them. Still, like I look back and I'm like, oh my God. So what happened with this? So the Civil War started on July 13th, right? We had done a couple drawdowns, and then I was designated emergency essential because I think I had been there sort of the longest, other than the ambassador. And again, like we had formed a relationship, and then as the analyst and providing these daily briefings, people came to really rely on them. So I was designated essential and ended up staying, and it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And I think I catalog it in the book. And so the day came, July 12th, where this guy associated with Operation Dawn, which was the Misraden militia, called and said, hey, so, and I'm paraphrasing, I have said it. So we're going to go ahead and start the Civil War tomorrow at 5:30. Cool. We're going to target the airport. And we just wanted you to know that we're not actually firing at you. We're just firing like right beyond you. So of course that was very concerning, but there have been a lot of threats. That one was like weirdly specific. So we took it a little more seriously. So my boss called in all hands, and we, got together in the office, and I briefed on what was going on and like the different threats that we were looking at and the credibility, which, 50-50, like it's weirdly specific, but we've just been like inundated with threats. So who knows? But because it did sound weirdly specific, we, got the order from the boss to be ready to go. So that night, packed up, like made sure everything was just so in my go bag, and, slept with my Glock right next to me, running shoes under the bed. Ended up waking up like 4 a.m. So, didn't sleep well. Like there was stuff going on throughout the year with like small arms fire, heavy arms fire. The rockets were definitely a different kind of a thing. And that morning they did start the civil war, and they started with an attack on the airport. And it was these rockets. So they're the Grad rockets, the sort of larger size. And they were firing like multiple barrages, multiple rockets in every barrage. So they ended up like the Marines were trying to keep count of the number of rockets coming in, and it was like hundreds a day. It was just insane. And so that morning, when it started, we got the code red alarm, went down to the bunker, grabbed my stuff, and it didn't stop. Up till then, it had like they'd done a couple of things, and then it had stopped, and you could sort of take a breath and go about your day, shake it off a little bit. But this day, it didn't stop. So we realized we were going to have to go in. So the security officer sort of, talked to me, got me ready, like, hey, we have to do this. We have to go walk outside to get to the office. And so for me, like, that's literally the first time in my life I've walked out into, a bombing campaign. So went out sort of the back door. So the, Mike 3, which was the 50 cal, was pointed like straight at the front gates. We kind of had to go around in case somebody was trying to breach the front gate. And so the way we went out, I could see the airport, and like you could see and hear the impacts on the planes, and the planes were exploding, and then like the billowing fire. And it just, it just kept coming and kept coming. So made it into the office, and that moment started it, the beginning of the end. So it was like that for 2 weeks straight. Wow. We were there, and it was just pretty constant every day. As the fighting progressed, it did start to move closer. So the Operation Dawn with the Misrat militia, they were targeting the Zindan. And again, like I said, that's the land we were on. So as they were winning, as they were making progress in their fight, it was sort of like tightening the noose. So I was very much looking at like which compounds they were taking over, which ones they were targeting, how close they were getting to our compounds, the embassy and us. So, and they did get closer and closer as the 2 weeks went on. And I say like one of the other like crazy moments was like after the ambassador had decided to send home that group of people. Again, I was going over there every day to brief her like while this bombing was going on. And it was that day was the first day that we really started to talk about like a full-scale evacuation in earnest, because that's the day we started getting hit with indirect. So like the embassy facility actually started getting hit quite heavily with some of this anti-aircraft weaponry. So the Marines were out there, and they were calling out everyone. So I think it's a little bit different too than other war zones, in that we didn't have reinforcements, right? There was nobody to call for help. There was
that's very much like in line with not really learning the lessons from Benghazi,
right? It's exactly the same. they were too far, right? It was still like there was the Marines in Spain and Rota and Sigonella, right? But it was still like, that's 3 hours away. So while this was going on, we're there. It very much felt like we didn't have any recourse, that we were totally on our own. There was not a Libyan military or law enforcement force that could come in and help us. We were relying until then on the militia. The militia was busy fighting for their lives, for their land. But on this day, when we started getting hit, I actually had to call the militia commander. So again, like this whole like crazy Jack Ryan moment. Nobody else in the room that we were in, because we had to hunker down and like we were all wearing our body armor and had all our weapons with us and like all grouped together in this little room. I was the only one in there that could speak Arabic. And so they called the militia commander and handed me the phone. And so like, thank God, like I had studied the vocabulary so hard, right? Like to have the recall in that moment to say, stop bombing the US embassy. Like still, like, I can't believe that I was in that situation and then I knew the words in that moment, right? So called him and he understood. They responded. He's like, dude, we're in the middle of a fight. And I'm like, yeah, you're hitting the embassy. So they came and they helped and they got, you know, that fighting to stop at least for a couple hours. And so we were able to do some cleanup, but that was certainly a turning point for like if people were scared before then, like that was terrifying. And I think it really kind of hit home that, you know, the Marines, their best option like is to duck behind sandbags. Like there was no recourse. We couldn't fire back. They weren't necessarily firing at us, even though we were getting hit, right? So there really wasn't anything we could do to defend ourselves. And so it was at that point, I think, that we really realized that we needed to change what we were doing.
Which militia commander did you call when you called them? Did the tenants or the attacking?
The tenants.
The tenants.
It was a desperate cry for help. Yeah.
And it was this about the time that, you know, you guys also initiate, I don't know what the terminology is, we would call it a destruction plan. You know, obviously the CIA has their secrets. They have their classified hard drives and whatever else I don't even know about. You guys had to torch all of that before you left, of course.
Yeah, and that was exactly like in the movies, like exactly. So it was just crazy. We finally got the order. It came a couple days later, actually, that we were going to evacuate. So again, called another all hands and talked about like, this is what we're going to be doing. We had about a day and a half to destroy everything before we had to drive out. But by then, like there had also been like a suicide attack against a nearby facility by somebody that, you know, good guys don't do suicide bombings, right? That's terrorism. So we knew that there were terrorists there in the city, and they found a couple of car bombs, BBIDs that were like just within a couple miles of our facility. So we're just like, you know, had this threat of an actual ambush. So like with Benghazi always on your mind, and then you're in the middle of this like militia fighting, and then, oh, no, terrorists are here. They're here in Tripoli. So we're really worried about being attacked, like them using it as a cover for an attack against us, them militia fighting. So we started with the most sensitive information, so the priority things to destroy, and kind of worked back from there. So the first thing was the hard drive. So we, you know, going through, yanking all the hard drives out of the laptops and like driving nails through them, and then like hammering them with sledgehammers, and then putting them on the fire. So we had this huge pit that we were getting ready to turn into a bunker. And so we just started it in there. It was like behind our compound, and used like incendiary grenades to get it started because there was nothing flammable in that fire. And just started piling on all the electronic equipment, all that stuff. And then we had to shred any papers, anything paper. And that was like the same, right? Like you have this like droning sound as you're like putting in the paper, and everybody took turns doing it because you're just standing there like trying to get it to go faster. And there's like so much pulp from the paper in the air that it's mixing in your like your lungs. And meanwhile, like the air is already like super nasty because it's like 2 weeks into this heavy fighting. So it's just like the stench of gunpowder in the air. Like the sky actually got black from all the it was just like the sheer volume of weapons being fired, and then like hitting the plane, so like jet fuel, and then they ended up hitting like a oil storage, like one of the big round oil storage things. So like the air was just nasty.
That's incredible.
And then you prepare to, I mean, it's the ambassador that has to make the call, right? Like, okay, now is, H hour, we're going to roll out. And the ambassador leaves with her entourage to come and meet with you guys at your compound. And like, I want to leave some stuff in the for people to go and read in the book about the rest of it. But can you talk about how that kind of like how it kicked off, how you guys came together and rolled out the door and started making your way? It was determined you guys were going to go overland to Tunisia.
Yep, she ended up choosing the specific route that we took. So we looked at a lot of different options, and I won't go into all of them, but the one we chose was to actually go south through Libya, down through like the Jebel Nafousa, so the mountains, and then up to southern Tunisia, and then up to Tunis. So I think a lot of people assume that we took the coastal road and just took a couple hours. This took 26 hours from start to finish. So it was quite long. I think everything just ended up taking longer than we thought it would. I think anybody who's been involved in like disaster response can attest to how that tends to happen. So yeah, the morning that we left, thought that like the best thing we had going for us is that nobody knew we were leaving. So as long as we could keep the evacuation quiet, that nobody talked about it, then that would help a great deal with our security, because we could just sort of sneak out. Whereas if people knew about it or they got some kind of warning, then they would have time to set up an ambush. And like I said, we were worried that's exactly what Ansar al-Sharia was going to do. And we knew that there were people associated with that who were involved in the current fighting. So the embassy, so some of the staff left early to go to the rendezvous at the compound. And so it was like an hour and a half, but it was enough that like I was truly terrified that people were going to find out, and people were watching. So it wasn't like nobody noticed. There was already fighting, like everybody was already up and fighting by then. So it wasn't like they just went under the cover of darkness and came. Not at all. They went down the main road. People saw them. The militias were already staged all along the sides of the road, getting ready for like their next face-to-face battle. And then there were already people out, like, the rockets shooting at each other. And so it did not go unnoticed. And so that made me really concerned for possible ambush along the way.
And it did leak like almost immediately, right? Like, oh, they're evacuating the embassy. Like they're on Twitter or they're on
right
Facebook
away.
Or whatever.
Yeah. So one of the main things I did there for like just getting like sort of atmospherics and like the tactical information was looking at social media pages. And that's where the Arabic really helped me, because everything posted first in Arabic. So I would check it like pretty constantly. And yeah, it was almost immediate that it hit social media that the US mission was evacuating.
So the embassy entourage shows up, and then it's on I think one of the gentlemen you mentioned in the book you named Harbor is one of the big ones organizing things, and then Nomad, your boyfriend, they're trying to like sort all of this thing out, get these vehicles in the order of movement. Like it sounds like the parlance of Dave and I would use, a clusterfuck is typically what we would call that.
Indeed it was. I think I call it like a really bad game of Tetris.
Yeah.
So the way the evacuation was set up is that we had sections, which we called chocks, right? We couldn't take the whole convoy out in one go, that we wanted to do it in sections, so that if one were ambushed, then the other sections could go a different route, or could like try to help or turn around, or whatever the option might be. So we were going out in these sections, and it was in a very specific order. So the lead vehicle and the follow vehicle of every section was driven by security officers. And then there were different vehicles in the middle associated with the US mission. So they had to be in a particular order, and we were all assigned, like we knew exactly which vehicle, what the vehicle was, the license plate number. Like it was very, very detailed too. And as you can imagine, like we had to report all that information up to like AFRICOM so that if we were attacked, they would know exactly who was in which vehicle. So it's actually really important that it be in the correct order for that purpose as well. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of room. So it was like trying to finagle the vehicles into the right order, and like one got hit like within minutes of being there. So it was just ridiculous catastrophe like that morning to have that happen, and everybody's like already on edge. Meanwhile, there's still fighting going on, right? It's still rockets coming in, and you can hear it, like when they're close, because you hear that whine, and it's a very specific kind of sound, so when it's getting close. And then everything's dark, like blacked out, except now you have all these vehicles and the headlights are off, but the brake lights are still going off. So it's like these red flashes like every few minutes. It was crazy.
So this happened sort of over a 2-week period to lead up to this point. Was the administration posturing to help you? Like they had some situational awareness. This wasn't an overnight situation. Were they signaling to you that you guys could count on reinforcements or some sort of
air cover, drone cover, something?
No, I mean, there was, I think there was talk about it, right? But there was so much anti-aircraft artillery being fired that it just wasn't a viable option to fly into Tripoli airspace. So even with the evacuation or sending somebody in to help, a lot of it was ruled out because of that, because we couldn't land safely. So we looked at some options where we could just drive a bit south and then get picked up there from some kind of air transport. I don't know what the administration was thinking or planning. I can tell you from my perspective in being there, it felt like we were just left there to die. I didn't see anything about plans to come in and get us. I didn't see anything about if we were gonna pick a side or they were gonna try to shore up. So then it was dignity versus dawn, were we gonna try to support one or the other? And there really wasn't much of that I heard or saw, and I was still reading everything. So I feel like if that discussion was happening, it was happening behind closed doors that I wasn't privy to. So on that, I don't know. I can only tell you what it felt like to me.
I mean, it's just interesting because if I remember right, there's a song and it has something about shores of Tripoli, which implies that there's also waterborne, exits available.
Weird.
I don't know, but I think that there was more than one exfil route available to you guys.
That was America's first war on terror. I'm sure you know, Dave.
I feel like it's very near and dear to every Marine's heart. I think we got the challenge coins from the Marines who were at our compound, and it definitely said to the shores of Tripoli. Yeah, so to get to the shores of Tripoli, we would have to go through the heaviest fighting.
Okay.
Which is why we couldn't do that. So we were south of the city proper, and like I said, kind of near the airport. And so you would have to get to the shore, you'd have to drive all the way through downtown, which is where the bulk of the fighting was happening.
All right, I understand.
The small arms. The rockets were being fired at us, but most of the small arms were happening on the streets.
There are a couple other questions I'd like to ask Sarah. I think maybe we should leave this epic 26-hour journey across the Badlands of Libya, leave that for your book. Let people go and pre-order In the Dark of War. What they can go pre-order it now. What's the release date, Sarah?
June 23rd. So
June 23rd. So it'll be out. And I'm remiss, but I will put a link down in the description for the book also. But something I kind of like jumped right over, I forgot to mention to you, is actually in the thumbnail even image for this video. There's this picture of you shooting this like super cool looking bow in the behind the compound you were staying at in Libya. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit like what's the backstory behind that picture?
Yeah, so that's my bow. So I think somebody guessed it was a Samick sage, and indeed it is. Sadly, that one I had to burn, but I have since gotten another one. So my stepdad actually taught me how to shoot archery. He married my mom when I was in like freshman in college, and so he did a lot of archery, and he was like, hey, if anybody wants to learn, and we were all like, yeah, who doesn't want to learn that? So he started teaching us, and then got my own bow, and anybody who's been in a war zone knows there's really not a lot to do. And I think our major source of fun was actually working out. So I had a few things in the book about like working out with the guys because they invited me. So I was like, sure, why not? Why not? And it was really fun. Like we had a great time. And so I asked my boss if I could bring back my bow from R&R, and he was like, excuse me, what? But yeah, he said yeah. And so I actually worked with the head of the security element to get some like hay bales and targets to put up there, and so just set it up in the back of the compound. And that was actually how Nomad and I ended up getting together. So I'm left-handed, and there wasn't anybody else there who was left-handed except for him. And so he came out like one day and we were joking about like, only left-handed people can go out and shoot. And then we decided like, well, one time when we both are free, then, we'll go practice, and made a bet and for, coffee. So I think I joked on Twitter, right? Like when you posted that picture, never bet a Navy SEAL unless you're willing to lose. I just figured like, of course I'm going to win. I've been doing this for like half my life. No, I lost, but it was a coffee date, and that's sort of how we started dating.
So you're saying that you were not hunting Ansar al-Sharia for sport with that bow. That's what you're telling me.
No, although I think every security officer there wanted to be the first one to get like a bow kill. Like, this is just for fun.
I can totally see that. We have some questions that I want to get to real quick. Andrew, thank you very much for the donation. He said, traffic in Libya sounds like driving in Indiana. And then he adds later on, Hoosiers are lawless people. So David, thanks for the donation. He has any observations of China in Libya? When you said all those different groups were operating there.
We didn't really have that much encounter with China there, and I know that they're pretty heavily involved in like sub-Saharan Africa, but mostly in North Africa. What we were looking at was like Egypt, the UAE, Sudan, the Russians. They were there, still there. Yeah, so different groups. It was just a little bit different.
Were these other embassies or these other groups, were they in as much danger as you were? Do you know? I mean, or had they struck deals? Were they actually targeted?
They were, yeah. There was a spate of kidnappings specifically against foreign diplomats. So the Egyptian embassy actually was targeted, I think, the most out of all of them. They ended up arresting in Egypt, they arrested a commander associated with one of the militias that was leading the kidnapping campaign. It was a specific group that was doing that. And so they actually went to the Egyptian embassy and took, I think, like 5 or 6 of them hostage, and were like rampaging through the city trying to find their ambassador. I think the most notable kidnapping was the Jordanian ambassador to Libya, and he was held for quite some time and then exchanged for al-Qaeda terrorist that Jordan had in custody, who was released into Libya.
Brendan, thank you very much. Brendan asks, he says, greetings from Australia. Thanks for the Mad Max reference. And which militia did Immortal Joe run?
Did what?
Which militia did Immortal Joe?
Is that a Mad Max character?
It's gotta be.
Is it a Mad Max? Is Immortal Joe a Mad Max character?
Master Blaster was running the militia.
That's Thunderdome. Let's see here. T-Bar, thank you very much. T-Bar says, can Sarah talk about the emergence of ISIS in Libya and how they came about? I remember being shocked at how powerful they got to be, especially in CERT.
Good question.
Yeah. So I think it kind of starts a few years back with people going, so Libyans and North Africans going through Libya to go to Iraq and Syria. So the North African sort of group of foreign fighters that were in Iraq and then later in Syria was the, I think it was the highest number. And a lot of them went through Libya to get there. And then particularly after the revolution, the main airport that we saw them going through was Mitiga. So they were kind of funneling through, and a lot of them at first were training in Darna and then Benghazi, and then it did later extend to CERT. But yeah, like we were literally there watching it happen, and we knew it was happening. And I kind of talk about that in my book again, In the Dark of War. That we kind of saw it as it transitioned, and they were getting, that was again another element that we saw getting closer to us. And that was like the worst one to get close to us. So it wasn't until after I left that they announced the presence of ISIS in Libya. But there was a pretty strong affiliation between the people, and particularly the people that had been fighting in Iraq and Syria and then came back to Libya.
You know, that the slave trade really opened back up after Arab Spring. Did that affect foreign nationals at all? Was that more of a local thing? Because it was very heavy in Tripoli, right?
Yeah, so kidnapping was really common. And I mentioned the kidnapping against foreign diplomats because that was like a pretty targeted and specific thing. But like kidnapping Libyan on Libyan was really common. That was happening quite a bit. And I think with the slave trade, that was sort of one of the most disheartening things to see kind of take off after we left. And kind of one of the things I really struggled with, like we left and it kind of created this power vacuum that that could happen. And yeah, they were doing like open slave markets. So a lot of people from sub-Saharan Africa would go north to try to get to Europe. That was one of the main routes they were taking. And because Libya was so lawless, that was sort of an obvious jumping off point that you could just pay somebody to get through. So yeah, it became a really big problem. It was starting while I was still there, like people trying to come through to try to get to Europe, but the slave trade didn't really start until after that, when they were getting stopped and put into these like prisons basically, and then sold at open markets. It's really tragic.
Alex, thank you very much. What do you think Libya will look like in 25 years?
I hope they're not still at war. I really don't know. I really don't. I have actively tried to stop reading about Libya because after a while it's too much, and you see all this stuff that's still happening, that was happening 5 years ago. But then the other wars, like you think about Afghanistan and Iraq, and we're still there, it's still going on. I hope that it's not. I hope that it stabilizes, but I don't know.
I wanted to ask you too, Sarah, if you could talk a little bit about I'm using the term, analyst burnout, that there's this stress that comes with the job, both emotionally, mentally, physically, maybe spiritually even. Like most people I think are familiar now with like post-traumatic stress, that like if you're a soldier in combat, that takes a toll. on the human being. And there's a need to decompress. There's a need to recover from that. But I feel like the American public is really not familiar with the specific type of stress and maybe even trauma that an analyst goes through when you're engrossed in this 24/7, like you were describing, like all day, every day. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, what that is, or even if I'm using the right term for it.
Yeah, so I did 12 and a half years total, and it was all counterterrorism. And so this book very specifically is about a year. It's about what happened in Libya. But, before all that, I kind of talked about it a little bit with you tonight, but it was long hours. You have to watch a lot of stuff. Like I can never unsee, right? And I think that in itself, sort of damaging to the soul, like some of the beheading videos, having to watch those, like all the document exploitation and stuff you would find on computers, like could try to stop it, but you can't unsee some of the things you've seen. And that in itself was quite difficult. And then just like then, the long hours, the constant, there was also this sentiment, like if you took a break, the terrorists win, right? Like, I'm sure you've heard that too, but like, it was very much the sentiment at the time that, like if you left early or like you went to your kid's birthday party or, you didn't put everything you had in you into the job, then you were letting the terrorists win. And it did, like, it became my life, right? It was really hard to leave because it was all consuming. I never like had kids, right? It became your whole life. And I know I made those choices for me, and other people made different choices. Other people had kids or got married or whatever. But for me, my sole focus was that it was all consuming for me, and it very much became like my entire life and my identity. So it was really quite hard to leave. But after Libya, that was whatever stress that I had from before. Like Libya was like no joke. A lot of post-traumatic stress just from that, from being there in the bombing. Like I can't do fireworks, right? Like I can't. But even like some of the other things, like I think people maybe don't realize is like the sense of responsibility to stop an attack or to not miss something.
Mhm.
So I very much felt like if I missed something and we were attacked, like that was my fault. And I realize the flaw in that logic, I do, but it felt like if I missed something, then it was my fault. If my friends in Libya that were there with me died, it would be my fault. And even going back to like some of the other things that happened. So like, I think people are familiar like with the coast bombing where 7 CIA officers were killed, like I knew a lot of them. So it's really hard to go through stuff like that and to not have it affect you. I don't really know how that's possible. For me, it's very personal. Like the work was my life and these people were my friends. So it was really hard to sort of like disassociate. I wasn't able to do it. I think maybe other people are, but at the time I wasn't able to. There are also things like, so I mentioned I was working like threats against the US, and when I decided to take the job in Libya, I had like one of my bosses at the time, he told me, like I was betraying the team, that, I couldn't go. And I was like, well, I need to do something else. Like I've been doing this for a while. And he was like, well, when there's an attack, like the next attack against the US, if it happens in the US, it's your fault.
Damn.
Right?
God damn.
Yeah. And then the Boston Marathon bombing happened. And like that was gut wrenching. Like absolutely. And I can know and I can tell you and we can talk about like, of course that wasn't my fault. Like that was an unfair expectation. It felt gut wrenching.
Talk about a fucking guilt trip.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said that now you try to avoid like reading about Libya. I mean, do you do you try to read about a lot of, do you avoid trying to read a lot about a lot of things? Like if you start reading about something, do you start trying to connect the dots? Do you start going into that kind of hole
Yeah.
oh, what have I found type of
Yeah,
thing?
I joke still, like you can't turn it off, right? Like I analyze and then I overanalyze and then I overanalyze my overanalyzing. Like you can't turn it off. So I still do that even now in my current job. So I didn't want to do anything related to Intel. Like I needed to be done with it. I needed to put it behind me. So I'm actually in emergency management now, and there are still like some parallels, right? Like I was in an evacuation and a shelter in place essentially. And so like the emergency response part was still really appealing to me. And so I'm doing that now, but yeah, I still do it in my current job where I'm like, well, what about this angle or what about that? And how does it connect? I'll probably always have that.
Was writing the book a therapeutic process for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I started writing it like right away. So one of my former chiefs told me that, recommended that I just write down some notes in case I was called to testify. So this is actually like, while we were still there because we weren't sure what was going to happen on the drive out. And so, like, spoiler alert, I lived. Right. But we weren't sure. So I started just like writing some general notes. And then when I got back and I was on home leave, started really writing it out more in like a narrative form. And then once it became clear, like I wasn't going to be called to testify because we made it out safely. So that was really like what they cared about. So I decided like the more I wrote about it, like the more it helped me, but the more I wanted to write about it. So I think a lot of this stuff happens like, and we never hear about it. That there's a lot of like, major operations or like these critical intelligence moments, and we don't know about it. And I feel like we all risk so much that it was a way to make it matter, like not just for me, but for them too. And like a lot of them, I think a lot of the guys have left. I don't think any of them are still in, maybe a few, but most of the people who were there in Libya at the time, I think it was quite a different experience because we were so like far like out there on the edge, and again, that whole sense of being totally on our own that I think most of them have left, and then this was a way to kind of make it matter.
Sarah, couple real quick questions here that actually someone submitted. If someone wants to get into the Intel world but can't and isn't wanting to travel a ton, what kind of job is best suited for them?
Analyst, actually. I did all my traveling because I wanted to, but it was not a forced thing. But yeah, most analysts stay at headquarters their whole career. And again, with choices, like I chose to do counterterrorism. I chose to do something that was going to keep me really busy and was like the center of focus. And like I wanted to be like in the center of things, but you don't have to, like somebody sits on the desk for like the most boring country you can think of, right? So it just depends on what you want your career to be like.
What are some of your thoughts on intelligence degrees being offered from various colleges like American Military Online, Indiana State University? Are those degrees worth the effort for a career in the intelligence world, or are you better off with a political science degree or something else?
So again, I'm probably not the best one to ask. I had an English degree. So how I ended up where I did, like it doesn't really make sense. And if anybody were going to ask me, like I should not have ended up where I did. But yeah, I think just having a degree is the important thing for most jobs. I think a degree in intelligence is just as valuable as a degree in foreign policy. I think the degree in foreign policy is probably better if you want to do like CIA, because you can learn more about sort of that interaction and how it works. But I did very well going from so I didn't start at CIA. I started at DIA, and so if the ultimate goal is CIA, it's also completely fine to start as an intelligence analyst somewhere else and then work your way in.
Are there any good books other than In the Dark of War? Are there any books you would recommend to somebody who is looking to get into the intelligence world that these are the ones you would hand them and say, hey, these are the must reads?
There's actually been a couple of other books very recently. I think you just interviewed Tracy Walder about her book, The Unexpected Spy, and then also Nita Bakos about The Targeter. So like if you're looking for something more recent about firsthand experiences, especially as a woman, then I think mine or either of theirs would be great. If you want to just like more general, like Cindy Otis, she has a book coming out about like how analysts, so she's an analyst, and so it's about how analysts learn how to assess if something is true or false. Her book's called True or False. So there's, I think, a wide variety. It just depends on what you're interested in. Like some of the most fun for me were like Spy the Lie, because like
I have that one. Yeah,
that's interesting to me. So I think it just depends on what your interests are. You can go from like firsthand account, like mine is, or sort of this like how analysts do their job, or like David Priest wrote about like the president's daily briefing. So I think it just depends on the interest.
Do you have more, Jack? Because we have a couple more in the feed.
Yeah, no, go for it, Dave.
Okay. Mike W., thank you very much. He says, hey, Jack and Dave, love your channel. Thank you very much. He says, thank you for sharing with us, Sarah.
Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much for the donation. And Sarah gives us a fox. So good job. David, thank you very much. You had to burn a bow. How did you get it there? And he goes, oh, she answered it. So they didn't try to stop you from bringing a personally owned weapon into a war zone?
No. I'm not sure they knew what it was, I'll be honest. I took it apart, right? So it's a takedown recurve, so you could take the limbs off. And then the arrows were arrows, but I didn't have the tips on them. So I put those on when I got there. So I don't know if they just didn't care or what, but they didn't stop me. I was a little worried, but I had permission. So we flew commercial to go in, which I don't think I said, or people maybe not be aware of. So I flew like Lufthansa from Germany to Libya, and yeah, nobody tried to stop me from bringing it in.
There you go, folks. David, thank you very much. Do you have any recommendations on more on the analytical side, like something with workflow and how to build a hypothesis and such?
Just like how to be an analyst, I guess. So I don't know. I think for me, it was just like reading as much as you can. So like definitely learn to speed read. And then I think you quickly kind of realize like what's important and what's not. I think that, talk a little bit about like how you do it, like the expression connect the dots just drives me out of my mind, right? So you can have all this information and like every piece of information is a dot, but when you have that, you can make any picture you want. So that's not actually how it works, that you take the information and you see everything that there is there, and then you have to use like your experience and your own logic and reason, and then that kind of analytic line that I talked about, and you start to see like patterns form, or like like if this guy over here says he's going to do an attack with like this vehicle, and then somebody else says something about like a different vehicle, like how do you figure out which it is? And you just have to add in like probability, right? So nothing you say is going to be like Al-Qaeda is going to attack at noon. Like that's not something that you would write. Even if the source says like Al-Qaeda is going to attack at noon, you would still be writing about the likelihood of that information being true, like what the target might be. So you're not just looking at one piece of information, you're looking at all of it.
Did you find yourself struggling or recognizing or confirmation bias at all when you were doing analysis?
Yeah, I think mirror imaging was probably one of the biggest problems is like, well, I would do it this way, so why don't they?
Right.
That was a really common sentiment, and I still hear it even now about like any number of things. And I think people forget that, different cultures think very differently than we do. And even somebody like you or I could see the same information and have a completely different view on what to do with that information because we're two different people. So I think for me, I saw the biggest problem with what we call mirror imaging is saying that because you would do it some way, then somebody else would do it the same way.
Interesting. Andrew, thank you very much. Can we circle back to Foot Lockers? How much cash fits in a Foot Locker?
No, I have no idea.
But Andrew, do you think she's like a Colombian drug cartel leader putting $20 bills through the cash counter? Like, no, she doesn't know.
What Andrew wants to know is if he could buy a giraffe with a Foot Locker of cash. That's what Andrew's trying to figure out. It's from a previous show, Sarah, where somebody had to sell off a giraffe as part of an accounting thing.
No big deal.
Ian, thank you very much. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your story. We can tell that it's personal, and I, for one, very much appreciate your candor on the subject.
Thank you.
Yeah, and also I'd echo that, Sarah. Thank you so much for coming on and spending some of your time with us tonight and being very patient with all of my very banal questions at times, walking you through some things that probably are pretty academic and boring. But there's a lot of people out there, including myself, who really don't understand, your job and what it entails. And I really appreciate you sitting down to lay it all out for us. In the Dark of War is the name of the book, comes out June 23rd. Tell people where they can go to find it. Like, is there an audiobook? Is there an ebook? People want to know these things. They want to know where they can find it.
You get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Books A Million. So anywhere you can normally get a book. It's available in hard copy and on Kindle. No word yet on an audiobook, sadly, but it is on Kindle.
Okay. And if I can twist your arm just a little bit more, Sarah, could I get you for 10 more minutes after we wrap up here to just do a quick bonus segment? I just got a couple other little tangents from the book that I'd like to ask you about.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Jack, what is this bonus segment you speak of?
Why, I'm so glad that you asked, Mr. Dave. So if you guys are interested in supporting the stream, there's a link down in the description to our Patreon site, and you can jump on there, and for $1 a month, you have access to all these bonus segments we do with our guests, like Sarah Carlson, and we talk about all kinds of strange and weird things, tangents. I don't know. There's some interesting stuff in there. Sarah, I sent you the one we did. That was a bonus segment we did with Andrew Milburn, where he was talking about working out of Malta. So I guess on the timeline of things, this would have been after you guys had evacuated the embassy, or during.
No, I think before he was in there. Before, yeah.
Okay, so as the war is heating up, they're evacuating the U.S. citizens.
Yeah, I think that was during the revolution. Yeah.
Colonel Milburn, arguably not making the smartest of all decisions, decides to not follow orders and gets on a plane with the Brits into Libya to help evacuate American citizens, which was quite brave, but he almost got in a lot of trouble for that. So that's just the kind of thing that we do for bonus segments sometimes. So if you guys can give this video a thumbs up, share it with your pals, put a comment down there, let us know how you think we're doing. All of that stuff makes a big difference for us. And please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already.
And I just want to add, Jack, you said that for only $1 a month, they can join our Patreon and get our bonus segments. And if you want to give more than $1 a month, you can, because Jack and I are paying the rent on our studio, which we can't use right now. And all of our, but anyway, thank you guys. We really appreciate it. Sarah, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
And thank you very much for having me on.
It's been amazing.
Yeah, thank you. And next episode, a historic moment for us on the Team House. All 3 Ranger battalions will be represented on the show for the first time. 3rd Battalion for me, Dave with 2nd Battalion. Our guest was a medic in 1st Ranger Battalion. So they will all be here. It's going to be a perfect storm of self-satisfaction, and we're looking forward to that. So again, thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Dave. And we'll see all you guys next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.